Okay. Happy birthday, Jaden.
Thank you.
15? 15? Okay, 15.
15 going on 30.
Do what?
15 going on 30.
15 going on 30. Well, I've been 15 going on 30 for, 12 years now or so? You too? So has Anita. All right. So in Bible class, as you know, since 4 weeks ago or so, we've been talking about people in the Bible that question God. Not in a bad way, but in a good way. They were asking questions about God's nature. God, haven't you promised to do this or that? So has it happened? Where is it? Things like that. And we also talked about how Jesus spoke in parables because sometimes a story is better at capturing who God is or what God is like than a list of things, Because when you have sort of a list of things, like a list of, attributes of God, that's sort of abstract. But seeing it happen in a story is more concrete. Okay, so we did all of that preparation work in our Bible class so that we could talk about hell. Because we had a question several weeks ago about hell and what hell is like, what hell is, who goes to hell, all these sorts of things. So we're going to try to cover all of that to the best that a human possibly could, which means there's going to be areas where we'll inevitably fall short at times, or we'll inevitably have to make a judgment call or just leave it up to God or whatever. But we're going to try to talk about hell in the next few weeks in the best way that we possibly can, from the Scripture, but try to answer questions about those, answer questions about this place and hopefully ask a lot of good questions about this place as well. Now, before we get into that, though, what we need to talk about is what does it mean for someone to be saved? And in order to talk about that, we have to talk about what's called the age of accountability. You heard that expression? The age of accountability. So the age of accountability, see, people reason like this, okay? An individual who was born, a baby, has no sins of themselves. Okay, they haven't done anything to warrant hell, right? And so if the baby dies, like in the case of David and his son, I just finished reading that the other day. It's part of this Bible reading challenge that I'm doing. And I'll tell you about that once I do it once, because once I do it once, then I think that you can do it. So let me do it once, and then I'll tell you about it. So David believed that his child was going to a safe place, right? He said, I can't bring him back, but I can go to him. And he felt comforted by that thought, okay? So that's our belief of children. But the argument goes, there must come a time when that child becomes accountable for their own actions, okay? And typically in America, we put that somewhere around 12, 13 years old. But you probably know of cases, as I do, very personal cases to me, where a child is believed to have reached the age of accountability as early as 7, 8, or even 9. Okay? Now, no offense to Jaden and Cherish at all by any means. But when I look back at myself at 17 years old, 16 years old, man, I didn't know nothing. I thought I knew everything, but I didn't have a clue. Now, yeah, I still don't know nothing. Every year it goes by, I look back on that, And part of something that's been so peaceful in my life is realizing that I didn't know nothing. That wasn't a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. Because once you realize you know nothing in comparison to God, it takes a lot of weight off your shoulders because you end up putting more trust in Him than you put in yourself. So anyways, there's this belief that people reach this age of accountability, which is typically around 12 or 13 years old, and when that person reaches that point, they're accountable for their soul, which means if they don't believe the right things, do the right things, worship the right way, go to the right church, whatever, then at that point, they're accountable. All right? Now, this brings up a lot of questions about what about those who have never heard the gospel at all? Okay? What about those who have never heard Jesus' message at all? But it also brings up a more troubling question, and one that's a lot more difficult and excruciating to answer, and that is, what happens to those that were taught such a distorted view of the gospel that they couldn't help but reject it? And that's where we come to a parable. Because, as I mentioned, Jesus used parables to talk. And so I want to use a parable that I made up, story that I made up, in order to try to illustrate this point. So allow me to read it to you, because if I say it, I'll miss a point. And everything in here is specific, and intentional. So let me read that to you. Jason was 12 years old when he was invited to Sanford Springs Life Church. It was his first time ever going to a church in his life, except for a random time when one of his basketball practices was held in the gym of a community church in his town. Jason's parents were atheists. They had both left cults in their early 20s that they were born into. They met in a support group and fell in love. Since then, they stayed away from anything that even looked like religion. So the decision to let Jason go to church with his friends was made after hours of intense conversation between themselves. They ultimately decided that Jason was getting old enough to begin to take responsibility for his beliefs. And so they let him go to church with his friend. Besides, they reasoned Sanford Springs Life Church was having a cookout and yard games that day. So how harmful could it be? Well, Jason went to church that day and heard a sermon that seemed to be the opposite of what a life church would teach. The pastor yelled, screamed, ranted, and raved about how evil the world was and how the tribulation was going to start any day now. He talked about sinners in the hands of an angry God, and he talked about how people that don't believe in God were ignorant, hateful, and consumed with sin. Those people, he said, would live in the hottest part of hell for denying God's Son. Needless to say, Jason was shaken to the core, but not in the conversion type of way. He barely could enjoy the cookout, and he definitely didn't feel like playing horseshoes. How could his friend that he sat beside say amen and preach it, brother, to that message? Didn't his friend know that he didn't go to church regularly? That he was one of those that was apparently going to burn in hell forever and ever by a loving God? And so Jason never went back, understandably. Because Jason reasoned that if that God exists, he really didn't want any part of it. And so 4 years later, Jason still hadn't gone back to church. And he looked at all forms of religion as systems of control. He had no interest in Christianity at this point because of the sermon that he heard when he was 12. You see, he knew that his mom and dad weren't evil. I mean, they cared for the poor. They volunteered regularly. They weren't, alcoholics or drug addicts or any of the nasty things that the pastor had said about them indirectly. At least he didn't see it. So driving home from school one day, Jason was killed by a drunk driver at 16 years old. There was no chance. He died on the spot. He then realized that he was standing before God in judgment. And God tells him, Jason, you reached the age of accountability 4 years ago, yet you didn't seek me. Depart from me, you worker of iniquity. God gave the order, and Jason was sent to hell to burn for trillions upon trillions of years. The intensity of his burning was like that of Hitler or Genghis Khan, just like the pastor said. After a trillion years, he was told by the devil that he'd barely spent a day there. Is this what you would do? Now, if you say no, you couldn't see yourself doing that, then the question becomes, are you more merciful than God? And then another question comes up. Did Jason ever even have a chance? Did he ever even have a chance? Well, Jason rejected Jesus. No, he rejected a mockery of Jesus. That's what he rejected. Well, Jason rejected the gospel truth. No, he rejected bad news, not good news. What is the difference between Jason and his companions that were raised in a Christian home? You may not believe in predestination, but it seems like we tend to believe in geographical predestination. In other words, that some of us just win the lottery and happen to be born into a family that are believers, and everybody else is most likely going to burn forever in an eternal hell. did Jason, again, ever really have a fair shot? Or perhaps your situation, which it is, perhaps you're kind of like me, and you went to school when you were in 7th grade, 6th grade, 5th grade, even maybe younger than that, thinking that every single one of your friends that you played tag with and played hide and seek with and things like that were headed straight through those wide gates that lead to destruction. And many there be which go there, because they went to a church where their pastor was a wolf in sheep's clothing and intentionally was feeding them lies and all these sort of things. I remember being in the 5th grade, and this boy came to school and told me that he had gone to church for one of the first times, and he finally believed in Jesus, and he was just so happy. And I didn't say anything out loud, but what I was thinking to myself is, well, he didn't do it the right way. That's what I was thinking. And I thought to myself, this guy, he's just lost. 5th grade. 5th grade. My biological dad, who was not a part of the same fellowship we're a part of, he told me that when he picked me up one Sunday afternoon after church to take him to his house and hang out with him for that afternoon before taking me back that evening, so I wouldn't forsake the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is at 2 or 3 years old, that I pointed to a church building going down the street and said, "That's the bad church." 2, 3 years old. How did I know that? How did I know that? I happened to be born, just so happened to be born into the one true church, won the lottery, whereas all my friends at school didn't have a shot. Now, these are tough questions, and I know that we're not the judge, but these aren't questions about who goes to hell. This isn't really what it's about. What it's really about is what kind of God do we serve? What it's really about is the universe a dangerous place? I mean, is the universe just a dangerous place where you are just basically having to fear for your life every single second? See, now this story I told you was fictional, but this isn't just a hypothetical situation. 13, 14, 15-year-olds that don't go to the right church die in car crashes all the time. I've got my sister, Brianna. She had a friend in high school, and he died in a car crash, and it was terrible for the whole community. And she went to my mom and asked her, is he going to hell? Because he was, 16, 17 years old, but he didn't go to the right church. Is he going to hell? See, these questions matter, because even though we want to run from them, and even though we want to hide from them and say, well, let's leave it up to God and things like that, what kind of God do we serve? Do we have more mercy than God? Do we understand justice better than God? I don't think so. So when we talk about the age of accountability, these situations, very real situations, have to be discussed, because we don't live in an ideal world, and some people might say, well, the world's not fair, but is God fair? See? If a kid comes to class, first day in school, transfers from another school, and the teacher's harped and harped and harped about how you're not supposed to chew gum in her class, and if you chew gum in her class, you're going to miss PE. And he shows up to school for his first time in her class, and he starts chewing gum. Is she going to send him the, time out at PE? No, she's going to say, hey, we don't do that here. Is that teacher more just than God? See? So these are some tough questions we have to answer. And that brings us back to the Exodus. Let's go to Numbers 32. Numbers chapter 32. Because here's the thing. The Bible does say something about an age of accountability. It actually does say something about it. Some people want to say there's no such thing as an age of accountability, but there is something as an age of accountability, but it's a little bit different than what we typically think. So in Numbers chapter 32, we read this in verse 10. The Lord's anger burned in that day, and he swore, saying, none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, for they did not follow me fully, except Caleb and Jacob and Joshua. So they are told that they can't go into the land if they were 20 years old and up. Now, let's complement this with another passage from Deuteronomy chapter 1. This is Moses recounting what had happened in that situation. And here's what he said in verse 39, verse 38 and 39. He says, Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter the promised land. Encourage him, for he will cause Israel to inherit it. Moreover, he says, your little ones, who you said would become a prey, and your sons, who this day have no knowledge of good or evil shall enter there, and I will give it to them, and they shall possess it. So, those who are 20 years and older, who had no knowledge, apparently had no knowledge of good and evil. Now, I don't believe that number 20 is a static number. Static is a programming language term, but I don't think that number 20 is a set in stone number for all generations. I think that it's because obviously we know 17, 18, 19-year-olds that are probably way more mature than maybe some 22-year-olds out there. You know what I mean? People are different. People are different. But in Moses' case, those that were 20 years and older weren't going to go into the promised land because they had knowledge of good and evil, whereas those that were less than 20 had no knowledge of good and evil. But here's the caveat to all that. These people aren't just people in the world who are born to parents of a different religion, or parents that were not believers, or parents that didn't attend church regularly, or something like that. These were people that were born to God's chosen people that were taught the commands and ordinances of God for the whole time that they were in the wilderness, right? Being taught from a very young age about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So this is not people that were born outside of the covenant. These were people that were born inside the covenant community. So what you see then is there is an age of accountability, it seems like, but it's more upon the basis of it more so applies to those who were taught about God during their life versus those who weren't. So then the question becomes, what about those who weren't? What about those who have no access to the gospel? What about those who've been taught something terrible about God or about Jesus, and their rejection of what they were taught is actually a sign of maturity, not a sign of immaturity? Because whenever you begin to talk to people who don't believe in God, what you sort of come to realize pretty quickly is the type of God that they describe isn't really what you believe either. And you would probably reject, that version of God yourself. You know what I mean? And this is why Paul said this. So let's go to Acts chapter 17, and let's take a look at Athens. Now in Athens, they wanted to make sure that they had their bases covered. And so they had an altar, they had objects of worship for everything under heaven, because they're thinking, well, man, if we just do enough, we'll please one of them, and then we'll not be okay, right? That was kind of their philosophy. So what they did in Athens, in Acts chapter 17 and verse 23, is they set up an altar that said, to an unknown God, because they're thinking, hey, we don't want to miss out on anything because, what might happen to us when we die. So we want to make sure everybody's covered, right? This is like, this is like when people give those non-answers, that are pleasing to everybody. We don't want to offend everybody, so we just give a non-answer, That's what basically they're doing. They're not really giving an answer. They're just saying it all, So here's what he says. He begins telling them about who God is and how he doesn't dwell in a temple made with hands and how he's not served by human hands and all these things. And so then he says in verse 30, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance. Notice that. Times of ignorance. God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he's fixed a day in which he'll judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. Now, notice verse 30. Overlook the times of ignorance. God overlooks times of ignorance, which means if someone is born into a situation where they do not come into contact with who Jesus is during their lifetime, God overlooks that ignorance, okay? But upon what basis then would they be judged? Well, look at Romans chapter 2. And Paul gets into this very discussion. In Romans chapter 2, here's what he says, in verse 14. He says in verse 14, for when the Gentiles, verse 14, when the Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. On the day, according to my gospel, God will judge the secrets of men through Christ Jesus. So, you have a situation where individuals who were in ignorance, they were raised outside of God's covenant community, would be would be judged based upon the things that everybody knows are instinctively good or instinctively wrong. You don't have to have a law to tell you that killing somebody, murdering somebody is a bad thing. People that don't even believe in any form of God understands that. But notice what he says there, those who instinctively do what's in the law. Now, what would we reckon he meant by that? Look at Romans chapter 13 and verse 8 to verse 10. Here's what he means by those that do instinctively what they find, or rather what's written in the law. Here's what he says, Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. If there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Or Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. In everything, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. So when someone who is ignorant of the gospel of Christ dies, upon what basis does God say they're judged? Well, he says, first off, they overlook their ignorance. They wink at it, is what the King James says. But in Romans chapter 2 and in Romans 13 and Matthew 7, what we see, what it all boils down to is love. Do they love their neighbor as themselves? Because if they do that, they fulfilled all the requirement of the law. Because if you love your neighbor, you're not going to take your neighbor's wife. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to steal your neighbor's car. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to kill him for sure, right? So if somebody loves their neighbor as themselves, then he says that's the basis upon which they'd be judged. The thing that people instinctively know to do. Here's that thing about instinctively knowing to do something. Do you know that the expression, love your neighbor as yourself, doesn't come from Jesus, it comes from the law. I believe it's Leviticus chapter 19, if I remember correctly. Loving your neighbor as yourself. But do you also know that people all over the world from varying religions or faiths or whatever also have somewhere in many of their books, many of their teachings, that one should love their neighbor as himself as well. Okay? And the reason why they have that in there might be because they got it from Leviticus. I don't know. But see, individual humans are made in the image of God. We instinctively know that we ought to do good to people and not evil. And it breaks one's conscience. It offends one's conscience that does evil to somebody and doesn't do good. And if it doesn't, then that's more of a sign of they either don't care, or in some cases with extreme situations, they have some sort of mental instability that doesn't allow them to see or think about the possibility of pain in somebody else. There's situations like that all through history. So the point, though, is when we talk about the age of accountability, we have to understand that God is not going to hold people accountable for something that they have no possibility of responding to. God is not going to hold people accountable, because we wouldn't do that. God is not going to hold people accountable for something that is beyond their control. What would God hold somebody accountable for, though? Being responsible for turning someone away who would believe by using the gospel as a means to get rich quick yourself. God would hold somebody accountable for us perverting the gospel of Christ and teaching a God that nobody with common sense who loves their neighbor as themselves would ever even accept. That's who God would hold accountable for that, not the person who didn't believe in anything because of what they were mistaught, you see. So when we talk about hell and the age of accountability and all these things, what we're really asking is, who is God? What is God like? If we're made in His image, if we can know things instinctively are good or wrong, what do our instincts tell us about some of the beliefs that we've traditionally been taught? What our instincts tell us about the things that we typically think about God. Now, the temptation here is to say, well, we should just leave it all up to God. Well, if we're going to do that, why did we ask these questions and want to have this discussion to begin with? If we're going to leave it up to God, leave it all up to God. Don't even talk about it at all. But this isn't a question about what hell is like right now. It's a question about who God is and how we live our life. Is the universe a dangerous place to live in? We always have to look over our shoulder? Or is it, as God said in Genesis 1, it is good? What kind of God do we serve? So when we go forward talking about hell, and I know we didn't get into a lot of specific passages today, but we're going to look at all the words that are used to translate hell. We're going to talk about some parables that Jesus talks about what seems to be a discussion of hell, but is really talking about something else. We're going to look at some passages from Revelation. We're going to look at some passages about discipline and justice and differences between what's called retributive justice and restorative justice. And so that's kind of what we're going forward in the next few weeks. Now, I would prefer to talk about some of that stuff in Bible class, because in Bible class we typically have open discussions. Okay, so if you can be here in Bible class, that would probably be for the best. But there are recordings available of every lesson, as you know, on our website, christiansinarcadia.org. So you can always go and find that there. But what you miss out on then is the discussion, which is where all the things are ironed out and everybody has a chance to voice their opinion or their disagreements or whatever. Okay, and again, let me reemphasize this. I even said it in this article that Ashley pulled from a couple weeks ago. I don't expect you to agree with anything that I say. Okay, I expect you to give me a shot. That's all I expect. And if we can agree at the end of the day that Jesus is Lord and that we ought to love our neighbor as himself, I've got no problem with you. Okay, and I hope you don't have any problem with me. We can disagree about stuff. We can debate about stuff. We can have even, arguments at times about stuff, because sometimes our emotions get the best of us. But what's most important at the end of the day is our unifying faith in Christ and our desire to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's what really matters at the end of the day. So we're having these discussions. We need to keep those things in the back of our mind, because inevitably something is going to be said that we disagree with. I talk so fast and so much that if you don't disagree with something, something's wrong. Okay? All right. Let me go ahead and pause the recording there. One more thing that I want to say is, before I end it, this is another thing that we have to think about when we're talking about hell. Okay? God is love, right? And perfect love casts out fear, is what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 4. So, how do we look at the discussion of hell through that truth? Okay? So we're going to think about that as we go.